Hi, everyone. My name is Funie, as Erica mentioned, and I forgot to mention in my bio that I actually used to teach elementary school. I taught first grade and fourth grade in Los Angeles Unified in between my BA and then getting my EDM. So I have that experience as well. I have some elements on the slides that are animated. Oh, thank you, Keisha. I think I have 4 things here, 4 separate text box, but I think the first one is 3 different parts. So I really wanted to emphasize in thinking about conversations and teaching and discussing AAPI communities, the idea of plurality. And then if you could click on the next one, complexity, and I think there's one more, nuance. And so I'll start even with this topic for today, immigration and diaspora, and to encourage us to approach thinking about AAPI students as coming from backgrounds that are infused with plurality, complexity, and nuance. And again, going back to the topic of today, even thinking about diaspora, for me, I identify as Taiwanese American. And so the question of diaspora is really complex, and it's plural because oftentimes people might assume that I'm ethnic Chinese, and in certain degrees, that's probably true. I never identify as that. I don't feel comfortable identifying as that. I identify as Taiwanese American with the acknowledgement that my family came as part of the early wave of Han settler occupants in Taiwan. But they've been in Taiwan for hundreds of years as part of the occupation, the ongoing occupation of the island of Taiwan. So I don't identify as Chinese at all. And so for me, the question would be, well, does diaspora represent how I'm seen as an ethnic Chinese person to a lot of people, or is diaspora in regards to me being someone who was born in Taiwan and has dual citizenship, Taiwanese and American citizenship. So there's plurality and complexity and nuance, and even within people which we assume are part of the same ethnic group. And I think it's really important for us to keep that in consideration. And maybe if we can go to the next image. As I mentioned, my family is from Taiwan. Here is a map that I thought was really fascinating because it shows not just a part of mainland China and Taiwan, but this is a map from foreignpolicy.com, and it shows the possible invasion points for if there was a Chinese invasion, which has been something that the Chinese Communist Party has been threatening for decades now. But in the last few years or so under the Trump administration and ongoing into this part of the Biden administration, there's more and more aggressive conversation on part of the CCP about the possible takeover of Taiwan. So I also wanted to use this map as a way to not show where the locale of where I was born, but also to illustrate the complexity and the nuance, because again, even people that might supposedly be from the same ethnic identity could have this tension and could have struggle within that identity, because here it's illustrated about that possible incursion from China and my political identification as being and cultural identification as being Taiwanese American and not Chinese American. So there's nuance all folded into that. And I also illustrate that to make a tie to US military intervention. And it's not necessary that the United States has intervened in Taiwan in the ways that it's intervened in other parts of Asia and Southeast Asia, but that there's this very kind of messy way that the United States has been involved in the political tensions in Taiwan for decades, especially after the movement of the Nationalist Party from mainland China to Taiwan, and the United States' support in that, and the ongoing development of the political nuance in regards to that. But the US military and American political and economic interests have definitely shaped my family's immigration to the United States. So if we could click onto the next slide or the next image. Thank you, Keisha. I actually came as part of chain migration. So going back to the complexity and nuance in my situation, my family's story is really different than a lot of other Taiwanese Americans who are in the United States, because many of them might not have necessarily immigrated through the pathway of chain migration. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the next slide. But they might have come because they were skilled workers. But my family came because we were sponsored by my uncle, who was a Black Marine who was serving in Vietnam. And during that time period, they would have, and I think probably now, they still have something that's called R&R, or rest and relaxation. So part of his service in Vietnam, he was let go to go on R&R, rest and relaxation. And part of rest and relaxation meant you can go to other American military bases or stations across Asia. And so Taiwan during this time period did have American military bases. And so my uncle, going on R&R, decided that he wanted to go to Taiwan. And so that second image, United States Air Force, I'm using that not because my uncle was in the Air Force, but because it demonstrates that there was this military presence, this armed force presence of the United States in Taiwan during this time period. And it's because he was there on R&R that he met my aunt. And they had children together, and then they quickly moved to the United States and then sponsored my mom and my dad. And my mom and my dad, again, departing from perhaps the more dominant form of immigration for Taiwanese Americans in particular, as highly educated, skilled laborers. My parents actually didn't speak English, and they were not considered highly educated in the way that we might conceive of them. My mother had a middle school education and my father had a high school education. And it really was because they were sponsored through this process of chain migration that we were able to come to the United States, or else we just would not have had the financial means to. And I was born, as I said, in Taiwan, and it was when I was quite young, I was about a year and a half, that we came to the United States. And so that's why I describe myself and I identify as a 1.75 generation immigrant, because although I didn't have any schooling in Taiwan, I really identify with that aspect of my life and what I know. And most of my family is still there. And I go to Taiwan as often as I can because a lot of my family is still there. And so that connection to Taiwan is still very strong for me, even though I left when I was quite young. And then the last image you see is a political cartoon with Melania Trump. And she's saying on the left-hand side, chain migration made easy, well, at least for my family. And I wanted to use this cartoon to both highlight the ways that chain migration has really been in the public conversation in the last few years, especially under the Trump administration, because it was something that they were framing as a threat to the United States and job security, national security, et cetera. And I also like to draw this connection to Melania Trump because I joke around and I say, I think this is the one thing that I have in common with her. And that's the fact that that her parents came through chain migration and my whole family came through chain migration. So I think, and I hope that is the one and only similarity that I share with Melania. Let's see, was there anything else that I wanted to say about it? Oh, okay. So one other important point that I wanted to make about the chain migration aspect, and going back to the concepts of keeping in mind plurality within identities and complexity and nuance, because my family came in that particular pathway through my uncle, and they weren't highly skilled in the way that people tend to think about that these days. Though they did contribute quite significantly to the economies and the jobs that they did. My mother was a garment worker and, up until she passed away, and my dad worked in the restaurant industry as a cook, and then did different odd jobs until he passed away. That my family was really working class. And that's another really big distinction between my family story and many other Taiwanese American family stories. Because as I mentioned, the dominant way that Taiwanese Americans have immigrated to the United States is through that pathway of being highly educated or coming for the pursuit of higher education and being highly skilled. So filling some labor needs in the United States. So there is a really big class disparity. And so for myself, my family, when we came, we ended up living in Orange County, California, which is still a really conservative, really religiously Christian area of not just California, but the United States. Less so now, but really the case when my family immigrated there. We immigrated there. It took me many, many years, I think, until I was in grad school to realize that we were there specifically because of my uncle's ties to the military and the fact that there is a military base in the city that we lived in. And I didn't understand that connection. I never knew why we lived in this random little town in Orange County until I took an Asian American studies class, and then thought about it more in my own studies, looking at Asian American communities and education. It wasn't until then that I made that connection to the US military and how much it's really shaped the lives of my family and the circumstances in which we came to the United States. So also in living in that situation in Orange County, there was a feeling of being a religious minority, and also even within the Taiwanese American community and the broader Asian American community, but especially within the Taiwanese American community, I really felt a sense of alienation. So I felt it in a sense of racial alienation from just being in Orange County in general, and religious alienation because I was raised Buddhist and I still practice in that tradition. But then within the Taiwanese American community, I really felt like I couldn't identify and it wasn't really part of the Taiwanese American community because my family was poor, not just working class, my family was poor. And that was something that I didn't share with a lot of other Taiwanese Americans. So
one more minute, please.
It goes back to the idea of holding AAPI students with plurality, complexity, and nuance. And so I have two more slides. The last slide I'm not going to share because it's just resources that will be shared later on. But the second slide, Keisha, if you want to just click through all of them, I think there's 7 bullet points. These are the pathways for immigration that were established through the 1965 Immigration Act that really transformed what the demographics of the United States look like in quite foundational ways, fundamental ways. It's number 5 that established family reunification, or this was the particular family reunification mode that my family was able to come to the United States in. There are some other ones, like number 4 points to that as well, but this was a pathway that enabled my family to come to the US. So I identify in the broader immigration of Asian and Asian American Pacific Islanders who also have immigrated through chain migration. So I'll stop right there. Thank you.